Hello, in this episode of Airs for Architecture, I speak with Nigel Cross, Professor Emeritus at the Open University, an expert in all things design theory, about the second edition of his fascinating book, Design Thinking, Understanding How Designers Think and Work, published by Bloomsbury in 2023.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Airs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Professor Nigel Cross to discuss his work in and around design and design thinking. Specifically, I think, the book Design Thinking, Understanding How Designers Think and Work for its second edition with Bloomsbury. But before we get into that, Nigel, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Okay, thank you, Ambrose. Yep, my name is Nigel Cross. I'm a British design researcher, which is what it says on my Wikipedia page. Somebody has kindly Wikipedia'd me. And that's probably the best thing I can say about myself. I am a designer, I was a designer, but I'm really an academic, mostly an academic. I've been an academic for most of my working life. And most of that working life was actually spent at the Open University in the UK, which is a distance learning university. Started off in 1970. Very new and experimental, providing education for anyone and everyone in the UK and later around the world, in all kinds of subjects. No entrance qualifications. All the teaching was distance learning. And so it was a very, for us who were there at the beginning, it was a very exciting and inspiring time to have to create this thing from scratch, really, how to teach things in this very different way. And that applied very strongly to us in design, because, of course, design education normally, this is in 1970, 71, design education was almost entirely sort of in the studio, over the drawing board, in person. So we were really hard-pressed to think how we could have some form of design education in the context of the Open University. So it was a very pioneering university, and one of the major innovations they had was a faculty of technology. And in that faculty of technology, they had something called the design discipline, one of 5, I think, small discipline areas. So that was how I got into design education. And so it's been a very different kind of experience that I've had to, I think, what most design educators, most design tutors and lecturers would have had. Mostly writing material for courses, also recording thick programs for the BBC.
Fantastic.
So that's my academic career. I was born in South Gloucestershire in England, just north of Bristol. So I do have a slightly Bristolian accent still, as some people can tell probably. And that was way back in 1942. So I'm getting on now.
That's wonderful. Do you come from a background of designers? How did you get into design itself?
Not at all, no. When I was at school, I studied in my senior years. I studied science subjects, mathematics, and physics. I had no idea until I really left school that there was such a thing called architecture, or a job that you could be an architect. I was going to be an engineer, a mechanical engineer, and in fact, I did start on that in my post-school education. First of all, I began as an apprentice engineer in a factory in South Gloucestershire, Dursley, the Lister factory, where they made marine engines, diesel marine engines, and agricultural machinery. So that was how I started. But it was a new kind of educational situation, where you spent some time working in the factory, well, doing an apprenticeship in the factory, but it was really, you were working, making things in the factory for about 1/4 of the year, 1/3 of the year, and the other 2/3 you were at college. So that was how I started out. And I had a friend at school who obviously did know about architecture because his father was an architect, and we began to meet up when we were at college in Bristol, I was going to the Bristol College of Science and Technology, studying mechanical engineering. He was at the Royal West of England Academy School of Architecture in Bristol. And I found that I enjoyed the apprenticeship bit, working in the factory, but I found that what I was doing in the college was very much like repeating what I'd been doing in my A-level subjects at school, the physics and maths. So I found it quite boring, really. And but going out of sometimes of an evening with my friend from the architecture school, I realised that there was this thing called architecture, and the architecture students seemed to be much more interesting and lively than my engineering student colleagues. So I tended to spend time with them. And then I discovered that in this college where I was, they had just a year or two before started a new course in architecture. So it was a very small school. And I thought, I wonder if I could apply and change from engineering to architecture. So I applied, despite not having an art qualification or the usual kinds of things that were expected for an architecture student. But as I said, it was a small school. They were probably desperate for students, and so they accepted me. So I had to go back to the factory and explain to them that I was going to drop out of the engineering course and I was going to change to architecture. They were very nice about it, and they said, well, I still had like a month or so of my contract with them to work. And they said, perhaps the best thing we can do is put you in the drawing office, which was a very good thing, because I then went and did some very simple engineering drawings in the drawing office for the last month or so there. So that was how I came into it, really, attracted by the lifestyle and the very different kind of education. These architecture students had all this free time, it seemed. They had studio time. They would work late at night sometimes, but during the day they seemed to be mostly having a very good time. So that was what attracted me to it, to be honest.
So you trained in architecture, but your academic research career, did you work in practice after did you qualify as an architect?
Well, again, I didn't qualify professionally, but again, it was a sandwich course. They called it a sandwich course. So we spent 2 terms of the year in college, and the other term, and what would normally be the long vacation, we spent working in architects' offices. Mm-hmm. So yes, I did over the 5 years of being in that situation. Mm-hmm. I had at least 2 years of working in architectural practices, and I spent also about a year or so afterwards. But quite soon I went into, I started to do a master's course afterwards, and I gradually realized that it didn't seem to be important to actually take the professional qualification exam. So I'm not a qualified architect, but I did have a full architectural education.
So I first came across your work a while back, and I picked up a book from the early 1980s called Participation in Design, perhaps?
Yes, Design Participation, it was called, yeah. 1971 it was published.
71?
Oh, sorry, 1972 or 3. 71 was with the conference. It was based on conference proceedings. 1971 was the conference, yeah.
It was really interesting. So I've read a lot around design participation, the historical sort of thread of it. So I was always interested in your thinking around design participation, and perhaps we can use that as a way of thinking about how you get into design thinking research. Is that the chronology?
Well, it really began when I was a student of architecture. As I said, it was a very attractive kind of education, very different from an engineering education. But as far as I could see, coming as really an outsider coming into this field of education, I thought there was something a bit queer about it, because they would basically, they probably, I don't know if it's still the same now, but basically there would be some lectures in various subjects, but the design work, the design education was based on studio work. They would set you a project, small projects to begin with, getting increasingly larger as you went through the years, to give you a design brief, and then you were more or less left on your own to come up with this design that you was to satisfy the brief. There was some over the drawing board tuition going on in the studios, but as far as I could see, they weren't. I was wondering, how do you do it? How do you do this design? Where do you begin? What are you aiming to do? And I thought that they really didn't teach us how to design. So I was quite successful by the end of the fifth year. My thesis in the fifth year was very well accepted, and I was got a good degree and all that. But in the beginning, I was obviously, I wasn't an artist. I couldn't do this kind of nice drawings and sketches that many of the other students could do. And I tended to do very practical kinds of solutions of things that I thought, I could build myself. This is how I would do it if I was going to do it for myself. So I think that was the starting point. I thought that they don't tell you how to do it. They just assume that somehow you're going to pick it up. They showed us, many examples of good design, good architecture, and it was only not until really not so long ago that I realised, I suppose what it was that we were supposed to learn from these precedents about what was good design and how to organise architectural space and so on, and how to, construct and create very nice buildings. But there were never any principles taught to us about how to do that. It was just history of architecture or looking at contemporary examples, but there was never any real analysis of how the architect produced it or how we were supposed to produce new building designs. So I think that was how I began. And around the middle of the 5 years, I discovered something called design methods. There was an organization called the British Architectural Students Association, BASA, B-A-S-A, and I got involved in that. I went to a conference, it must have been around 63 or 64, where Chris Jones, who wrote the book about design methods, who was a design methodologist, one of the main figures. And I met him at the conference and discovered this subject called design methods. I discovered the work of Christopher Alexander and his notes on the synthesis of form. And I tried to use his method in my final year project. I found I couldn't do it. It was far too complicated and difficult to actually follow what he described in his book. It all looked straightforward in the book, but trying to do it in practice seemed devilishly difficult. But I use some kind of ideas from how to organize, a large space. My final year project was a large school design. So I did learn or get some ideas about how to begin to organize some of the spaces from things like design methods and Christopher Alexander's work. So that was how I got into it. And then I went to study with Chris Jones for this master's course in design technology at Manchester at UMIST, and that was it. The rest is history. I worked with Chris Jones for a very long time after that, or quite a long time after that.
Is this the Chris Jones that ended up being head of Leicester?
No, this is John Christopher Jones. He wrote, his book came out in 1970. It was called Design Methods, Seeds of Human Futures. And he'd begun life as an engineer and an ergonomist. He was working in ergonomics, and he had this very, very nice course in Manchester, master's course called Design Technology, and it was about new things like ergonomics, operational research, computing. And also, it was quite a good research education and research training. We learned things like statistics, for example, and how to do experimental work. So that was how I got into being an academic and a researcher, from starting with how do I do this stuff called design, and looking for ways in which I could organize the job of, the activity of designing through things like design methods. And I got into computer-aided design as well at that time.
I was reading recently, I've been doing research work myself around issues of creative and design thinking, critical thinking in environments that are not architectural. And I've been thinking about the ubiquity of design, the way that design, as you say, is as distinct activity with parameters, but at the same time, it's also a sort of universal characteristic of the human animal, that we design things all the time. We're constantly designing things. And then so I got thinking about this, and I was thinking, for example, like scientists design experiments. So a good scientist is a scientist that not only has good hypotheses, but good ways of speculating on the outcomes of the organization of space, materials, processes, and people towards certain ends, in their case in scientific laboratories. I've kind of been thinking about this idea of design quite a lot recently. And it was, I suppose, in my mind, triggered by something I'd read about in a book that I never found again. I think it was a book on permaculture, but I was looking at the idea that Hannah Arendt talked about design as something between art and mathematics, as a kind of a separate faculty of the human imagination, a trainable faculty like art or mathematics. And so I was looking around on Google Scholar, and I found your paper on design thinking, more recent paper, Design Thinking What Happened, or words to that effect, isn't it? And this explosion in enterprise, in commerce, around this idea of design thinking, particularly deployed in sort of creative workshops and team building workshops in corporate and third sector environments. And thus I made contact with you through Bloomsbury. To begin any discussion about what this design thinking is would require someone to define what design is. And obviously you've spent quite a bit of time thinking about that. And I was wondering, how do you define it?
Yes, that's always a good question. And I think there are probably never very good answers to it. What I would like to say is not to try to define design as such, but to talk about designing, because that's what I've been studying, researching, and writing about. And I think the key thing for me is to see it as a form, as a skill, as a form of skilled behavior, not as a talent or a gift, something which you just magically have or you don't have. It's a form of skill. It's a set of cognitive and practical procedures that designers do in the process of designing. So that I think is the most important thing for me to come out of what I've been researching, is to see it as a skill. And if it's a skill, then it's it can be enhanced, it can be trained, it can be educated, you can improve it in the same way that many, all kinds of skilled behavior. You might have some aptitude for it, or you be interested in it, but you move through stages from being a novice to becoming an expert. Hopefully, that's what it's about. Whether it's in music or playing football or being a designer, it's something you perhaps want to do, and good tutors can help you to develop that skill, which it's a complex skill. It's not easy. It's quite difficult, and it's quite unlike some of the other skills. And it's also, it's not art and it's not mathematics, so it's not like those things. I think that's one of the key things also, which I would like to say, is that it is something quite different. And that was how I began to get into thinking about what is design thinking. When, to go back to when we started at the Open University with this new thing called design, and teaching it at a distance, we had to think about, we're not now training people to become architects or graphic designers or fashion designers. We're trying to provide a general form of education for a large number of people from all kinds of backgrounds with all kinds of interests who are not necessarily studying to become a professional designer. We had to think about what is it that's of fundamental value to anyone, the man and woman in the street who might be interested in design in some sense, not know anything really about it. We had to try and make up these courses, invent these courses about designing, which were aimed at a very general population. And at the same time, in the UK, in the 1970s, there was the beginning of design in general education in schools, where some of the subject teachers were gradually moving from things like craft work or art or domestic science. They were moving it towards a new kind of subject area, which they were calling design, or design and technology, as it later became. So that was a kind of thing which was going on in the 1970s in the UK, certainly, and possibly more worldwide as well. And we had to think, it was kind of forced upon us to think, well, what is it that we can teach that is some universal general appropriateness for a large group of people, who, as I said, are not necessarily, some might want to go into it, but not necessarily wanting to become a professional designer in a professional design job.
It's interesting to think that design as a discipline, this kind of technique, or as you called it, cognitive and practical procedures and the complex skills, they aren't really taught in architecture schools that I've experienced. And I don't imagine my experience is that different from other places. Why do you think it has been the case that design has been, in a way, ignored as a set of practical skills? It can't be that that's always been the case. Or maybe it has. Is it something to do with its slightly mysterious quality, its association with artistic people who are sort of magicians, that we sort of allow their space and we don't sort of peer too closely at what they do? Or is it because in a kind of late modern world, the idea of quality design has, particularly in built environments and quite substantial parts of material culture, sort of receded, like people don't really care?
I think it probably goes back to, well, certainly in architecture and any of the other design professions, I suppose, it goes back to the roots of education. And I mean, the atelier system in architecture, where basically an architect, a practicing architect, has some apprentices or students, and that architect tries to develop in those students the ways of working and thinking that person does themselves as an architect. It was a transmission of knowledge and skills just through the profession, I think, is what it always was before. And now it's something much wider and broader than that, and much more challenging in a way. And I think that's why we have had to come to this idea of design now in general education, is that we have to see it as a discipline, as a field of study, as a discipline in its own right. And that began again with that work in the 1970s about design in general education, where people began talking about design as a third area of education, different from the sciences or the humanities, arts and humanities on one side and sciences on the other side. And this idea that design actually is something quite different. It does have its own designerly ways of knowing, designerly ways of thinking, which are not the same as in the sciences or in the arts and humanities. And that's been a big challenge. I don't think it's been so ignored, as I think you said just now, but it's taken quite a long time, because I think it's quite a difficult thing to do. And that's mainly what I've been doing for many years now, is what is this thing called designing? How do designers do it? My point really has been, how do designers do it? They're not always very good at explaining how they do it. Obviously, some of them are extremely good at it. Some of us are not very good at it. Some are quite good, and some are very, very good at it. I was, struck by the fact. After a while, I went into design. I was interested in design participation, as you say, at one time, thinking, well, with computers and design methods, everybody can be or can become a designer. It's not such a mysterious process after all. But I began to realize that actually there are some people who are very good at designing, and it's people are prepared to employ them because they can do things which they can't do for themselves. Architects and other designers can be very good at providing new, interesting, lovely things, which most of us lay people, really find it quite difficult to do. So I began to quite admire what good designers do. Try to understand, talk to them about it, learn what they could say about it, and investigate it in various ways. And really, that's to come back to the book. That's what the design thinking book is about. The subtitle is Understanding How Designers Think and Work. And that's what I've been trying to do. And in the book, there are the bulk of the book is based around 4 case studies. There are 3 outstanding designers that 2 of whom I interviewed. One was Kenneth Grange, who's an outstanding product designer. Gordon Murray, who was an outstanding designer of Formula One racing cars, and Victor Scheinman, who is an outstanding engineering designer. And I did interview studies with Kenneth Grange and Gordon Murray, but with some colleagues from Delft, we did some what are called protocol studies, experimental studies with Victor Scheinman, and also with a group of designers, a small group of 3 designers from IDEO in California. And we set up these observational experiments to try to see what it is they do when they're designing. We gave them a small project to do, and we video recorded them, audio recorded them, and set up a big, well, not so big, but set up a conference of design researchers to analyze these experimental studies. That's a major part of the book are those case studies and what we can learn from them. It's not just when designers themselves talk about their designing or how they design and what they do, they can be, they're not themselves going to be very analytical about it. It's like the millipede or whatever going upstairs. If you stop to think about how you're doing it, you might actually lose the ability to do it. So I don't blame them at all for not, that's not their job to be articulate about it. Their job is to get on and do it. It's for the others of us, the design teachers, the design researchers, to try to be a lot more articulate about what they're doing. So that's what's in the book are a number of studies of outstanding designers and good designers, both interviews and formal experimental studies. And then I try to relate it to what we've been learning over these years of studying, of researching in design thinking, the more academic side of trying to understand and articulate what design thinking is and what it is that designers do when they're designing. And I think that goes back, always to the very beginning of myself as an architecture student, wondering what it is I'm supposed to do if I'm going to be, how to design a building. They didn't really give us many clues as to how to do it. And I think also I've said I think articulate quite a lot, and I think one of the things which I hope is very useful for students and possibly also for practitioners is to have somebody who is trying to articulate it, to explain what it is you're trying to achieve as a design student. I think that's what was missing from my architectural education. It was never very clear about what it was we were trying to achieve, except to produce attractive buildings. And I think to help people to become a designer or to become an architect or to become any skilled person is for someone to try to explain to them, to articulate to them what it is that you're trying to achieve. If you ask people who are very good at it, they might not be very helpful. But there are other people, tutors in design schools, who I think should be trying and helping to articulate to the students what it is they are, what it is they have to achieve to be good at their job.
Yeah. And that's, as you say, a combination of cognitive and practical skills. Techniques, I wonder if they might be called. Do you see in this research some common ways of thinking and common techniques deployed by good designers that instigates their design process? For example, is it always a type of drawing? Is it always a type of strategic planning? Or is it very individual? Is it very unique to the designer themselves?
I think it can often seem quite unique, but it's quite, designers often will say it's intuition or something like that. Mm-hmm. But I think, in the book, there's a little case study of Philippe Starck's design for the Juicy Salif lemon squeezer. Mm-hmm. Starck is a typical, very good, exceptional designer who doesn't articulate it very well at all. He doesn't need to. And he would say things like about that lemon squeezer, the strange object that he produced, was it suddenly just jumped into my mind. It was a kind of flash of inspiration. It just jumped into my mind. But again, some of my colleagues at the University of Delft had gone into the study. Fortunately, he designed the Juicy Sally lemon squeezer on the placemat in a restaurant here in Italy, where I am now. And he fortunately kept the placemat. He designed it, in about half an hour of having a meal at this restaurant. And started with like doodles on the placemat, thinking about this. What he'd just been given as a brief was to design, a new piece of kitchen equipment for the Alessi company, and he decided to go for a lemon squeezer, a lemon juicer, and he begins to sketch things on the placemat. But because we have that record of how he was thinking and drawing go very much together. Drawing is a way of thinking, really, or a way of helping thinking. And in the book, there's this analysis of his design process, and it's a fairly standard form of design process. You start with some little, perhaps, conjectures about how it might be, and then he moves to an analogy. The sudden moment of inspiration is when he has a dish of squid come to the table, and he begins to think of the lemon squeezer as something perhaps like the shape of a squid. So that's a classic creative thinking technique. Draw upon analogies, quite perhaps far distant types of analogies, and use them to inspire what you're focusing on, what your current concern is. So he does go through a fairly standard form of design process, but of course, Stark being Stark, he says, "Oh, it's just a great flash of my genius that came up with it." And I found that with the other ones, right? With Gordon Murray, the outstanding Formula One designer, Kenneth Grange, outstanding product designer, and Victor Scheiman, the outstanding engineering designer. Underneath what they describe is something fairly similar, where, for example, they all go. One of the things they do is go beyond the brief, or they challenge the brief. They challenge some of the requirements that are being set in the brief, and they set up some kind of tension between what they want to achieve. They want to achieve something which is even better than what the brief is asking for. Mm-hmm. And they set up a kind of tension which helps them to become creative. And they do this thing called problem setting, problem framing, or problem finding, which is to find a way of looking at this problem that they've got in a way which suggests ways to resolve it. It begins to suggest solution possibilities. It's called problem framing, and so they have that kind of period of where they're doing that. So sometimes that can be very individual. They can bring individual things from it. Sometimes the same kinds of things. It's the same kind of thing that some architects will do. I think they will have some kind of paradigms or prototypes in their mind of what they would normally do in this situation, or what they can borrow from other examples, which begins to suggest ways in which they can identify a solution area that they can move into. And then, having got that, in all cases, of the ones I studied, in all cases, they then go to what I called first principles, which is to go back to the basics. I mean, Gordon Murray was talking about it's all basic physics in the end for a racing car. It all comes down to basic physics. Once you've got the idea of this problem frame and some kind of solution concept for it, you go then to these first principles. And there are, in all kinds of subjects, there are innumerable first principles. You can't just say to students, well, start from first principles, because they'll say, well, what first principles? Which ones? And that's what the problem framing helps these designers to do. So I think it can look as though it's very individual, but in fact, there are some underlying approaches that you can see that these, from ordinary designers to outstanding designers, they do have ways of proceeding which are fairly common, and across a great range of objects. When we're talking about Formula One racing cars or sewing machines for Kenneth Grange, or the project which we gave that Victor Scheiman tackled was basically a bicycle rack, for carrying luggage on a bicycle. So very simple things to very complex, high performance things. And if you analyze it in the way that I did, you begin to see that there are underlying strategies that they adopt.
So this idea of problem framing, which I find really enticing, do these designers, when presented, for example, with the request by Alessi to design a new kitchen object, the designers, Stark in that case, is looking at ways of imagining problems in existing instruments so that they can design a solution to that. So you can see this much more clearly in, say, for example, Formula One racing. You don't know what Ferrari are doing. You're in McLaren. You've got to imagine how they're going to make their car quicker and stick to the road harder, and your driver die less. So there's kind of immediate problems. But I suppose I'm wondering about particularly product and also architectural design. To problematize things is quite complicated, I suppose.
Well, it is.
I'm interested in this idea of problem framing.
Yeah.
And this idea that designers problematize everyday concerns. So they're presented with a brief which asks them to design a new object.
Yeah.
But there isn't a problem. Like the juicer, for example, answers a problem that didn't exist.
Yes, quite right. Yes. And quite a few people who said it doesn't answer it very well. But, it sold millions of products, so it was good in that sense for Alessi, the company. Yes, what triggered in my mind when you're saying that was I've written things about it a little bit. So what I call constructive discontent is a kind of frame of mind that designers have. I began to, after having been through an architecture course, I began to realize it myself. That you see things and you think, well, that isn't very good. Why was it designed like that? I mean, I think it could be better. And certainly with Kenneth Grange, the product designer, very much was like that. He says, I always go around thinking, well, that isn't very well designed. I'm sure I could do better than that. And I think that is something which is a designerly kind of way of thinking, is to have that idea that, designers know that everything is designed. So somebody's responsible for it. So if it doesn't work very well, it could probably be designed to be better. And I think that is a trait that designers have. It can be sort of annoying and uncomfortable to be a person like that, because you're always saying, well, that should be better. I mean, I think I do have it myself to some extent. I'm always thinking, why is it like that? And if I've made bits of furniture and so on, I think, well, yes, I know why I made it like that. It's because that was a standard size of timber that I could buy from the timber shop. That's why. But sometimes they see, think, but it could have been better. It could have been thinner or thicker. Or
do you get a sense that aesthetics plays quite a role within design thinking? And obviously, looking at product design or engineering design, one would assume that there's a much greater emphasis on utility in these things. So I'm thinking back to what you were saying at the very beginning about the idea of precedent in architectural education. And I suppose one of the things with precedent is it's a way of kind of generating conformity to aesthetic preferences within a given culture or a culture of architecture. Do designers think aesthetically as well as systematically, technically? Is one of their driving focuses the idea of beautification within a process?
I'm not sure I would use the word beautification, but I would use a word perhaps a bit more like elegance. I think, Gordon Murray is a Formula One racing designer. His cars, kind of, people would often say, it's a very elegant design. There's something elegant. I don't think they are striving for an aesthetic purpose, but certainly in engineering, I think, if there's a lot of idea that if you design it from first principles, and so that it's going to work well, then it will probably look well. Now that isn't always true, obviously, but I think there is a concern with coming up with something which is elegant. It's again a bit like being constructively discontented. It's something might work okay, but it's there's a sense of it not looking quite right or looking a bit ugly, but I'm not sure they come with it. I'm not sure I would call it aesthetics, but I would use the word elegant. You want an elegant solution. You can have an elegant solutions in mathematics, for example. So, it's a kind of human trait to want to have elegance in things.
That's exactly what I was thinking when you used that word. I immediately started thinking, oh, yes, of course, they talk about elegant equations.
Yes, yes.
Not being a mathematician myself.
Well, that's an elegant solution to the problem. It's because it's kind of minimal, probably. It's kind of obvious in a sense, and it works. That's yes, elegance is used in all sorts of contexts.
Yeah, and I do think that that's probably at the heart of very competent architectural design. It's why designers like Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier and Glenn Murcutt and folk like that retain their position as significant, again, to go back to this idea of precedent. It's because their solutions, many of their solutions, seem to have that kind of mathematical elegance about them.
Yes, and I think it also ranges across all levels, from the big broad concept to the small details. I think again, I think good designers are very much interested in the details of things, getting the details right. It's not just I'm loath to name some architects who I think don't have that kind of sense, but they would just produce a swirly, voluminous building sketch, and but the details are, if you actually visit those buildings, I find some of them the detailing is pretty crap.
The other thought that I was having as you've been speaking is that you've talked about professional designers and design thinking as a characteristic of professional designers, but most of the world self-produces the environments and the tools that it uses, or much of the world, and historically, obviously, most of the world, but still through things like DIY, but also through vernacular environments. Lay people have been in charge of design production, and it's produced. I mean, we go to vernacular places because they're more beautiful than professionally designed places in many instances. I was wondering if you think that this process of design thinking that you see deployed by professional designers is a refinement of a natural characteristic. And I'm looking at the environment that you're sitting in at the moment, which is clearly a very old Italian farm building.
Well, it's a small cottage. It's part of a village. It's not out in the wilds. It's not a farm building, but it's a
Rural building.
It's a working family's cottage, yeah.
Yeah.
Which I wouldn't say it was elegant though, but it works quite well within the context of the situation that they had.
Yeah.
I think you're referring to things like craft work, immense histories of craft work, vernacular work, and so on, where a lot of it, as far as I understand it, comes from doing things as they've always been done, because the way they've always been done, they weren't always done that way, but they gradually evolved, I suppose, to become something which was suitable. It suited the materials that were to hand. I mean, this house is built from the rocks which have just been taken out of the it's on a kind of cliff face is where I'm living, and you can see that some of the big rocks around the door are just taken from the rocks that are just just outside. So things like what materials are available, what tools have you got to work them, what's the environment like, what is the job that this thing has to do. There's a classic case of thinking of farm carts. There's a classic case way back in the 1930s about how the wheels on a cart have this extraordinary dish shape in them. They're not if a child draws a wheel, it's kind of just a circle. It's in more or less 2 dimensions, but the cart wheels are 3-dimensional objects where the hub is not in the same vertical plane as the rim of the wheel. And that was something which looks incredibly difficult to do. It is difficult to do, but the wheelwrights and who made the wheels had developed these techniques with the tools and materials they had available to them, and it solves quite a lot of kind of unseen problems that you wouldn't know until you're using the object, and you find out, oh, that isn't working very well, it's breaking us, and so you adapt it slightly, and you begin to get to a solution which is elegant and appropriate and works well. And once you've got that, unless something happens to change it, and of course the Industrial Revolution, and presumably now the post-industrial revolution, change and will change and is changing lots of things. But when there was a very stable environment, then I think there was a kind of artificial evolution going on, in which things stabilized around quite good solutions, or the best that was available, best that you could do in that situation that you were in.
So sort of design as a design in the terms that you're thinking of, or design thinking as a characteristic of late modern abundance in a weird kind of way, of opposed, as you say, in industrial professionalization, which is the meat and drink of architecture, I suppose.
Well, yes. Yes, architect. Well, one of those professions that's emerged after craftwork.
Yeah,
where they were designing things separately from making them, whereas before, people were making things as they'd always made them, or as they'd been taught how to make them.
Just the last question to finish off on. Obviously, artificial intelligence, which is emerging at remarkable speeds. Noam Chomsky described it as digital plagiarism, I think he described it as, which I thought was quite a good name for it.
I've not heard that before. Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah.
I mean, that is what it is. I mean, sifting through the internet to steal people's ideas to turn into quote unquote something new is less enthralling than calling it artificial intelligence. But be that as it may, artificial intelligence seems to be one of these things that's emerging. Do you think that there is still a place for this form of design thinking in the contemporary world, given AI?
Well, I'll start by saying that I was once asked to give a keynote lecture to a conference on AI in design, but that was many years ago now. It's back in like 1980 or something like that. So it's well before what we now regard as AI. So I referred to. I said I began the talk by saying the opposite of artificial intelligence is often thought to be natural stupidity. But what I want to talk about is the natural intelligence that designers have, because it's it is a form of intelligence. I believe designing is. I'd like to now think that it's not just a form of thinking, but a form of intelligence, So I tried to explain to them what was the complexity that goes on when designers are designing. So it's not easy to sort of replicate in machines. But it also takes me right back again to my very early research. And when I was a student, I tried to use one of my friends in the architecture school was by then doing PhD work, and they were working in computer-aided design. And he helped me with a little computer program which would they used to try to do kind of optimize floor plans in large buildings. And so for my school, which is quite a large building, he helped with running his program to kind of try to optimize what the floor layout would be. It didn't really work again, but it gave me some starting points to work from. And so when I was doing my master's, my own PhD, that was in computer-aided design. And the thing which kind of turned me against computer-aided design is I thought that what computers would do when this is right back in the 1960s and 70s, what computers would do would be to change the nature of design in architecture as a job. And I'd worked in architecture. I'd worked in architectural offices, and I thought they were very good places to work in. It was an enjoyable job. And I thought what computers are going to do is make it a more stressful job and a more automated kind of job. I wrote a book called The Automated Architect, which was rather critical of some of the computer work which was going on. It threatened the quality of the job as well as the quality of the end product of the building that was going to come out from that process. And I did suggest, and again, this is right back in 1960s, that I did some studies of I tried to simulate computer-aided design systems that didn't then exist by using we had a team of experts linked by closed circuit TV with a designer. An architect was given a small brief to design to, and by sending messages backwards and forwards, we in the back room pretended to be the computer that was providing these answers. And I found it, although it was a very simple and crude thing, it did, in debriefing the designers afterwards, they would often say it was quite stressful because, there was this damn computer coming back with these answers, not very quickly, really, because it was only us sitting in the back room, with some information that we could give back. But they said it was quite stressful to do it, and I began to think that working with CAD, with CAD, is probably not going to be a very nice experience. But I did one experiment when we suddenly switched these roles around, where the people in the back room, we switched around. So the computer, it was a human being, obviously, but it was pretending to be a computer. It was doing all the work, was doing the drawings and proposing solutions. And the designer would sit back and criticize them and say, no, that's not right, and no, don't like that. And I said, I remember writing that was that we should, those early CAD systems should have a much more active role, that they should have some more intelligent behavior. What I think is emerging now is not quite like that. It's something quite different. But I did have that view that what was going to happen was that the job was going to be spoiled. The job of being an architect was going to be spoiled. And what I would worry about now is whether, again, there's a threat to this idea that I don't understand why you want machines to do things that human beings can do perfectly well themselves, and they enjoy doing it. I think being a designer is a great job. It's a wonderful thing to be able to do. So I don't know why you want to remove these jobs, unless to save money, of course. You don't have to pay them the fees for doing it. It's like playing chess. Machines that play chess. What's the point of having machines that play chess? What's the point of having machines that design buildings? It isn't so much that you can let the machines go ahead and play chess to their heart's content. So what's the point of it? People enjoy playing chess and people enjoy designing. So don't take that away from us.
That's indeed true. And it's a great point to finish on. Thank you very much, Nigel.
Oh, thank you, Ambrose.
Jane Jacobs said, "Design is people." So is Soylent Green. Thanks to Nigel for taking the time to speak with me and for discussing his book so generously. Thank you to Bloomsbury for the edition. Please see the podcast descriptions for links to it, to Nigel's profile. And thanks for listening.